Hello and welcome back to History for Today. This morning I'm coming to you from my office at Bemidji State University, and I am going to talk this morning about the way that I have used the note-taking process and the way that I am going to teach it to my students. I began taking notes on books years ago, probably decades ago. But I got very good at it and I got very organized about it when I began taking notes in grad school, and especially in the PhD program at the University of Massachusetts. For example, I took an American environmental history course with David Glassberg my first semester in the PhD program. I had originally signed up for a U.S. historiography course with Bruce Lurie, but David said his environmental history course also filled the requirement for U.S. historiography, so I switched. I'm not exactly sure that Lurie ever really forgave me for dropping his class. In Glassberg's class, though, we read a series of the foundational texts in the field of environmental history, which at that time was only about 30 years old. So we read people like Alfred Crosby, Donald Worcester, and of course lots and lots of William Cronin. And we read Ted Steinberg's first book, Nature Incorporated. Steinberg's book was the story of the textile industry, built in the 19th century along first the Charles River and then the Merrimack River in New England. It was quite an eye-opener for me. I had gone to visit cousins in the Lowell area throughout my childhood, but I never knew anything about the city's history. Steinberg wrote this book first as a dissertation for a committee that included Morton Horwitz, whose book on American law I've already reviewed here. Nature Incorporated is a very useful narrative of exactly the types of changes that Horwitz had described. And probably reading Steinberg's concrete examples first primed me for his mentor's much drier prose and much denser argument. I'll review Steinberg's book more completely another time. Right now, I want to talk about the note-taking process. As I was reading this text in the grad seminar, I highlighted and wrote notes in the margins of the print book. I actually have 2 copies of this book for some reason, but this was the first one that I used in processing the text. And this is still my first step in processing a text. I was looking for passages that jumped out at me, that interested me, so that I would have something interesting to say on discussion day. Probably I was also thinking about whatever Professor Glassberg had said to introduce the text when he had first assigned it. I don't remember any specific instructions, but by the time I got to graduate school, I was pretty good at discerning what a teacher was looking for in an assignment. As I was reading, of course, I was also open to whatever Steinberg might say that seemed important or that seemed memorable. Having a book assigned in a class gives it a fairly high level of authority. So I was expecting to learn something, and I was looking for valuable takeaways. If I'm honest, I was probably a little bit less focused on how the author had structured the book than I might have been. After all, it was my first semester in the PhD program. I didn't realize until much later, for example, that this had been Steinberg's dissertation. This became obvious only when I had a little more experience. After reading closely and highlighting the whole book and taking notes in the margins and at the end of the text, not just processing it using the quote-unquote grad school reading techniques that I'll talk about in a separate podcast, I then went back through it a second time and reviewed my highlights and my notes and copied out paraphrases or quotes into a word processing document that I could then print and take to class and refer to during the discussion of the book later in the week to make me look prepared. As I wrote, I began to see a little more of the structure of Steinberg's argument and his narrative. Honestly, I probably quoted a little bit too much rather than paraphrasing at that point in my student career. I think as students, we tend to quote more because we feel that the author has more authority than we do as readers, and that we can deploy quotes as ammunition in support of our interpretive arguments. This technique has, of course, a long pedigree that goes all the way back to biblical and Talmudic scholarship, where, of course, the text is authoritative because it's considered to be of divine origin. Nowadays, I'm much more comfortable with my status as a peer of an author, so I suppose that makes me more comfortable with paraphrasing. Even so, I need to make the point to my students that paraphrasing is their quick route to understanding. In some classes in my grad program, the reading assignment had included a review essay that we would turn in before class. That got me into the habit of writing reviews of all the books that I read, even when I wasn't turning in the essays for a grade. I had been a blogger by that time for nearly a decade already. And so when I went to grad school, I started posting my reviews on a special page on my personal website. Many of them are still up on the web on a page in the environmentalhistory.us domain, which has received thousands of visits over the years, recently from China, India, Spain, and Finland, as well as the US, according to the cluster map that I put on the page to track my readers. So to review, the process for me was first, read and highlight with the professor's framing question or my own motivation for picking up the book in mind. Second, copy the margin notes and quote, or better yet, paraphrase the passages that I had highlighted that still seemed relevant and important to me. And then third, reflect on those notes once I had them all in a document and formulate either what I would say in a class discussion or what I would write in an essay. This is still my basic process. The one change, as I mentioned, is that I'm much more comfortable now paraphrasing rather than quoting, unless a passage is just so important or so well stated that I both paraphrase it and quote the original words. This is the technique that I want to teach my students, and I want them to become proficient at, because I think that it helps to sharpen their reading and analysis skills, as well as to practice their writing, and nothing builds skills like practice. So I'll have more to say about this topic and more specific details to share as I develop this program for my students. But I hope some people found that interesting. Stay tuned for more. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you again next time.